Welcome to this study of the Godhead. I'm Roger Campbell. I serve as a gospel preacher for the Greens Lake Road congregation in East Ridge, Tennessee. Thank you for being a part of this study. Tonight we're going to introduce the topic of the Godhead and look at some evidences for the existence of God. Now this is an 8-week session. So we're going to have 8 classes, and I know that that's not a lot of time when you're thinking about the Godhead, but I think we'll be able to cover some matters that will be helpful to us. God willing, in our second lesson next week, we're going to begin to talk about some of the attributes of God. What's God like? And then 2 weeks from today, we'll be doing a second lesson on the attributes of God. And again, we're going to cover the attributes of God in 2 lessons, and it's going to have to be, a condensed version of those great topics. And then our 4th lesson is going to be the Godhead, existence of evil and human suffering. Does human suffering prove that there's no loving God? Well, we're going to talk about that. And then in our 5th lesson, we'll be talking about the oneness and triune nature of God. Triune means 3 in 1. And then in our 6th lesson, we're going to be looking at some specific questions about the Godhead. And it may be that we'll use that lesson also to cover some questions that came up in our earlier lessons that we were not able to cover adequately. And then the last 2 lessons in this series will be a study of the Holy Spirit. The Godhead. You might even wonder, does the Bible even mention the Godhead? Well, the answer is, in our English versions of the Bible, the word Godhead is used in a number of them, but not all of them. In the King James Version, the word Godhead is used 3 times. In the New King James Version, the word Godhead is only used twice. And in the American Standard Version of 1901, again, the word Godhead is used only 2 times. Well, in the King James Version, the 3 references to the Godhead are all found in the New Testament. We read in Acts 17 that when Paul was preaching in Athens, when he was at Mars Hill speaking about the God of heaven, the Lord who created the heaven and the earth, he said, we shouldn't think that the Godhead is like unto silver or gold. Now in that reference in Acts 17 and verse 29, the New King James Version says, "Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold." So the King James and the American Standard Version have the Godhead in Acts 17:29. The New King James has the divine nature, and the ESV has the divine being. The second time in the New Testament where we find the word Godhead in our English Bibles is in Romans 1 and verse number 20. In the King James reading, it says, "Being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead." And in the New King James, again, you have the word Godhead. But in the American Standard, you said that God's everlasting power and divinity are visible from the things that He created. And the ESV in Romans 1:20 has divine nature. So I think you're picking up on this, that in some cases you have the word Godhead. In some cases you have the translation divine nature, divine being, or even the word divinity. Now the third time that the word Godhead is used in the King James Version is Colossians 2 and verse number 9. And there we read in reference to the Christ that the fullness of, for in Him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And that's a case where The word Godhead is used in the King James, the New King James, and also in the American Standard Version. But once again, the ESV does not have the word Godhead. In Colossians 2 and verse 9, it has the word deity. For in him the fullness of deity dwells bodily. And so if you have those materials that I shared with you by email, then if you look at the meaning of the Greek word which we've listed there in the table, then you'll simply see that there are different Greek words involved in those references that we had just now. Thayer says it means the state of being God. It means the divine nature. So when you think about Godhead, think about the divine nature. When you think about the Godhead, think about God. Think about the Godhood. It's a fascinating study. And the things that we know about God in terms of His attributes, what He's like, what He's done for us. If you and I want to understand God as much as is humanly possible, well, the only way for that to happen is for God to reveal Himself to us. And what that means is if we're going to learn about the Godhead, we're going to have to learn that from the Scriptures. Okay? The Scriptures which begin with the statement that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. There's no specific or precise definition of God given in the Bible. It just begins with that statement that God in the beginning created the heavens and the earth. Now, I'm certain that in your dealings with people, you have come across or heard about people that they're not ready to receive the notion, the idea that an eternally existent, all-powerful God created them and thus has the authority to give them instructions about how they ought to live their lives. Some people are not ready to accept that authority. Makes us think of the king of Egypt in the days of Moses and Aaron. When God sent Moses and Aaron in to speak to Pharaoh and said, God's message is, let my people go. Do you remember what Pharaoh's response was? His question was, who is the Lord that I should obey His voice? Exodus 5 and verse number 2. Now, maybe not everyone says those exact words. Maybe they don't say it in the same way that Pharaoh said it. But a lot of people have that same mentality. Why should I obey God? Who is God? And so, hopefully, our lesson tonight will begin taking us down the path of having a better understanding of God's existence, God's nature, and God's revelation to mankind, because we live on the earth. It's only temporary. And we are going to be somewhere forever and ever. And the wonderful message of the Bible is God basically reaches out His hand to mankind and says, I want you to live with me forever. Perhaps you notice in the materials that I shared with you that we're going to do our very best to employ the law of rationality, which basically says this: we only should draw those conclusions which are merited or warranted by the evidence. In other words, we should only draw those conclusions which are based on proof or evidence. And so tonight in this first lesson in our study of the Godhead, we want to talk about the existence of God. And in the course of our lesson tonight, I want to speak about three basic evidences. Now, perhaps you have studied this topic before and have encountered a long list of different types of evidences. Tonight, I'm going to share three with you. Three that I personally consider to be the clearest to present the truth about God's existence. The three that are most persuasive in my way of thinking. But before we look at those three lines of evidence, let me suggest to you tonight that there are some horrible reasons for a person to claim that I believe in God. In other words, if they were to share with somebody, here's the reason I believe in God, these are not convincing at all. Some things that are called proof are not really proof at all. Regardless of the topic, whether we're talking about the existence of God or how to worship God or how to be saved, regardless of what the topic is, if we're trying to convince someone about a particular matter, and the reasoning that we use, the information that we share that we think is convincing evidence, if it's not good evidence, if it's not a solid argument, we're not going to be able to persuade people. Now remember this. We can teach the truth, and that's no guarantee that people are going to accept it. But let me mention a couple of things that someone might say that in reality, that's no proof that God exists. Someone might say, I'll tell you why I believe in God. I believe in God because that's the way my parents taught me. I believe in God because that's what my parents said. Someone else might say, well, that's interesting. Because I don't believe in God, and the reason I don't believe in God is that's the way my parents taught me. So you've got one set of parents who teach their child, don't believe in God, there's no God. You've got another set of parents who teach their child, believe in God. And both of the children say, well, the reason I believe in God is that's the way my parents taught me. Well, which one of those is most convincing? For a child to say, my parents taught me to believe in God? Or for a child to say, my parents taught me not to believe in God? And the answer is, neither one is convincing. Look, if you were raised in a home where your parents or other family members believed in God, you're blessed. But the fact that they believed in God, that doesn't prove that God exists. And that's not a good reason for you and me to say that we believe in God. Someone else might say, well, I believe in God because I can feel Him in my heart. Someone else might say, well, that's interesting. That's the reason I don't believe in God. I hear you people who call yourselves Christians talking about God in your heart. He says, I don't feel God in my heart, and so I guess there's no God. So one person says, I know God exists because I feel Him in my heart. And another person says, well, I'm sure God doesn't exist because I don't feel Him in my heart. Well, which of those is the most persuasive or most convincing type of evidence? And the answer is, neither one is convincing. Neither one of them is proof or evidence. I was present when something took place. A small child was taking a nap, and a parent went in to check on the child, and the child was not breathing properly. It was an infant laying on its stomach. Child wasn't breathing properly, and so we called the authorities, and things were taken care of, and before you know it, the baby's breathing normally. Thank God for that. Well, someone made the statement. Because the baby was not breathing properly at one point in time, and then a short time after that, the baby was breathing properly. Someone made the statement, well, if that doesn't prove that God exists, I don't know what could prove it. I don't know what could convince somebody. That's not convincing proof. Are there not parents who have faced the horror, the tragedy of going in and finding their child not simply asleep, but dead? Should they conclude because their child's life was not spared, that proves that there is no God? Well, of course not. And so, neither of those cases, the child recovering or the child not recovering, that doesn't prove whether or not God exists. But let's look in this lesson at three lines of reasoning, three arguments, okay? And the first argument I want to share with you in this lesson is the argument of design. Now, sometimes there is a fancy name given to this argument, and the name that's sometimes used is teleological argument. And I share that with you because you may from time to time read that word, or you may hear that word used. It simply is the idea that where there is design, there must be a designer. And in our universe, we see evidences of design. And so if there is design in the universe, there must have been a designer. And the Bible calls that designer God. Look, we use this type of reasoning all the time. In the material things that we encounter in life, we see material objects, and when we see those objects, we know that there had to have been design involved in that object. We know they didn't come about by accident. Right now, I am recording this lesson in advance. And there is a camera which someone planned, someone designed, and then it was produced. You might think about a computer or a handphone, a cell phone. Well, that cell phone didn't fall out of the sky. That computer is not the result of some explosion in a factory. Because when you look at the computer and you look at a handphone, then you know that there's design in that object. It may be an object that's quite expensive. It may be an object that's not expensive in comparison. But still within it you see design. And again, the reasoning is where there is design, there must have been a designer. Suppose I visit someone's house or their apartment. And I said, boy, I love this place. Who laid this out? Who arranged this? And you tell me, well, no one arranged it. No one planned it. No one designed it. It just kind of fell into place. Would you believe that? Me neither. Because in a house or an apartment, you would see ceilings and floors, windows, doors, lights. All of those things individually and collectively indicate design. And where there is design, there had to have been an intelligent or multiple intelligent designers behind it. And I have the reference here to the Apologetics Press study course that came out in 1992. Now, if it takes a mind to build a computer, who can believe that it did not take a mind to produce the mind that built the computer? As we think about the material universe in which we live, you don't have to go any further than the human body to find plenty of design. What was it the psalmist said about himself? He said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalm 139 and verse number 14. The way in which the human body functions, it's incredible. You know, as you look at individual body parts, you look at the eyes and you think about the function of the eyes and the function of the ears and the function of the hands and the lungs and the heart. Speak about the heart. How did the original human, the original pair of humans, Adam and Eve, how did they know that their body needed a heart? How did they know that they needed blood vessels in their body to carry the blood to the heart and away from the heart. How did they know that they needed that? Well, it wasn't Adam and Eve's decision, was it? It was God's decision. And how does our body know that it needs kidneys? And how do those kidneys know to remove the bad stuff and retain the good stuff? Now those are two simple examples. They're not in detail, but you get the point. Our kidneys and our heart and our other body parts function in the manner that they function. Not by accident. Not because there were humans who existed at one time and they say, you know, we really need to upgrade. Our body really needs a heart. No, a human being would not function without a heart in the beginning. Wouldn't function properly without kidneys. Wouldn't function properly without lungs and ears and eyes and all of those body parts. Someone suggests, well, if you just look at the skin. You know, who ever heard of a house that reproduces itself? The roof reproducing itself. Well, that doesn't happen. But the roof, that is our outer layer of skin, it's being reproduced over and over and over. That's a really interesting study just to examine the human body. Well, let's apply the thought of design to other things in the universe, to the universe itself. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse number 4, the Bible says, every house is built by some man, but he that buildeth all things is God. Every house built by some man. But he who built all things is God. And so if we look at the universe as being a house, so to speak, and we find design within that universe and its functions, then what would that indicate? There had to have been a builder, a designer. And that's right. And the Bible calls that builder God. Or we think about another Bible passage that speaks along the lines of evidence in our universe. Psalm 19, beginning in verse number 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Verse 2, day and day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So the statement there in verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. The heavens and the sky and all that's in them demonstrate handiwork. They demonstrate or show that someone's hand was involved in bringing them into existence. It is as if, it's not literal, but it is as if the heavens and the firmament are crying out to mankind, God made us. You know, sometimes you'll see this small airplane fly over an activity, and behind it there'll be a banner. And it's if the heavens and the firmament are displaying this banner that says, God made us. We might consider the distance from our planet to the sun. And that distance is 93 million miles. And scientists who are in the know tell us that distance from the planet Earth to the sun, that's just right. That if we were 10 degrees closer, 10% closer, that we'd burn up. If we were 10% further away, what things would freeze. And so, you know, makes you wonder, how did our Earth know to be in that location? Well, the earth doesn't have a mind. And certainly it wasn't by accident. Another thing the earth has is a very predictable, precise orbit. In 1 year's time, the earth orbits the sun. And as it's orbiting the sun and as we're moving, it's a very predictable pattern. So that scientists with the know-how are able to predict in a specific year, specific day of a specific month, at a specific hour of the day, where the earth will be in its orbit around the sun. And so you've got the distance from the earth to the sun. You've got that predictable orbit of the sun and a number of other factors. And all of those lead to this simple conclusion. In our universe, design is evident. And where there is design, there must have been an intelligent designer. And the Bible calls that intelligent designer the Lord God. And we learn about Him in Psalm 147 that His understanding is infinite. That He is able to number the stars and knows the names of all the stars. And so, the first line of reasoning, and the one that I consider to be the clearest form of evidence and the most persuasive, is the teleological argument. The argument from design. Second line of evidence, argument number 2, is cause and effect. Which simply says, for every effect, there must be an adequate cause, an adequate explanation. Not every explanation is an adequate, appropriate explanation of a result that occurs. Now, sometimes this cause and effect argument is called the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument, okay? And it simply says for every result, there must be an adequate cause. My vehicle is leaking oil. You say, well, when did you notice that it was leaking oil? Well, it had never leaked before Sunday. But I noticed Sunday morning that after I drove it to services and got out of the vehicle, there was oil under my vehicle. And that morning, I ate a cereal that I had never eaten in my life. And so I guess that my eating that cereal, which I've never eaten before, that's what caused my vehicle to leak oil. Well, that's an explanation. But that's not an adequate explanation. Or someone else might say, well, the other day my vehicle began to leak oil, but it didn't leak oil until after I was driving in the rain, and so I suppose the rain caused my engine to leak oil. No, that's an explanation, but it's not an adequate cause of that. Okay? Our universe exists. Now, that's an undeniable fact. Regardless of a person's religious convictions, regardless of whether a person believes in God or doesn't believe in God, all of us have to admit that our world exists. Okay? Now, would that our world's existence, would that be the cause? Or would that be the effect? Would that be the result? Or would that be something that caused the result? And the answer is, our Earth's existence is the effect. And so our question is, how do you explain the Earth's existence? What would be an adequate cause of the earth existing. At different times in history, different explanations have been offered. Someone says, well, maybe our universe has always existed. That is, our universe is eternal. Or a second possibility someone suggests is, our universe somehow created itself. A third suggestion, the universe came into existence by accident. And the fourth suggestion is that the universe was created by something or someone. Well, think about the explanation that our material universe is our material universe is eternal. That is, that it's always existed. Well, you might wonder, well, how did lifeless matter turn into living things? How did life come from non-life? Because the law of biogenesis indicates that life comes only from life. In fact, life comes only from life of the same kind. And so it's just not possible, even over long periods of time, that lifeless matter could turn into something that's living. So the suggestion that our universe is eternal, well, that's not an adequate explanation. That's not an adequate cause. Well, it's impossible for a material universe to create itself. And as you think about the things we've said about design, it's not possible that this universe could come into existence by accident. Because there's design which cries out for the explanation that it came from a designer. And the only sufficient, adequate explanation is that our universe came into existence as a result of an intelligent designer making it. And the Bible calls him the Lord God or Jehovah. The adequate cause is Almighty God. And so one line of reasoning is we believe in the God of heaven because of the design in the universe. Secondly, we believe in the God of heaven because the universe exists. That's the effect. That's the result. There had to have been an adequate cause, and the cause was the God of heaven. And the third line of reasoning is what we commonly call the moral argument. M-O-R-A-L, moral argument. Now, among human beings, among living things, among living beings, humans are the only ones who have a concept of morality. Now, you and I can train certain animals to do certain things. You can train a tiger. Some people can train tigers to do certain things. Some can train bears, some can train elephants, some can train dogs and cats to do certain things. But none of those animals which I have just mentioned have a sense of morality. None of them have a concept of this is right and this is wrong and I ought to do this and I ought not do that. So this sense of oughtness, that is something that only humans have. Now again, we recognize that the thinking of some humans is not what it needs to be when it comes to morality. In other words, some people's concept of different moral topics, it's not correct. It doesn't harmonize with the truth of the Bible. So people can have mistaken ideas about what's right and what's wrong. But all humans, when push comes to shove, all humans have a sense of some things are acceptable and some things are not acceptable. Now I know that some people perhaps initially will say, look, I believe every person has the right to decide for themselves what's right and what's wrong. I don't think a person would apply that idea consistently if that person's wife and that person's children were being abused. I don't think they would say, well, that person who is abusing my wife and children, he has the right to do that because he thinks it's a good thing. I'm pretty sure when push came to shove, he would draw the line somewhere. And in that drawing the line between things that are unacceptable and things that are acceptable, things that we ought not do, things that we ought to do, this sense of rightness and wrongness, only mankind has that concept. Now, we may use terms where we don't even say right and wrong, but we get across the point that we're trying to make, saying, you know the right thing to do. I'm preparing, I'm sitting here and I go and get some food and I come back to my previous place of sitting and somebody's taking my seat and saying, hey, that was my seat. What I'm really saying is, the right thing to do is allow me to sit in this seat. And for you to stay in that seat and not allow me to sit in it, that's the wrong thing to do. Although I don't use all of those words and say such a thing. I say, hey, that was my seat. Oh, I'm sorry. And so many people then will say, hey, you need to have this seat. Somebody says, well, no fair. I gave you part of mine, why can't you give me part of mine? So when we use that language, no fair, there's that idea of rightness and wrongness. We say to someone, look, you promised me that you would do it. Well, now you need to do it. There's that sense of rightness and a sense of wrongness. So, regardless of people's level of morality, and regardless of the moral system which one endorses or which one practices, all humans have a sense of oughtness. This is the way things should be done, or this is wrong. Animals don't have that. But it makes you wonder, if it's true, if it were true, that animals evolved into humans, that is, humans came from animals, then why wouldn't they have a sense of morality? Why wouldn't they have a sense of oughtness? They can't explain that. The Bible's clear in Genesis chapter 1 that the humans are made in the image of God. God's eternal. There's an eternal part of us. God has this concept of right and wrong. Humans have this concept of right and wrong. We have a responsibility to the God of heaven, which the animals don't have. So if there's no God, then there's no such thing as evil. If there were no God, then there would be no such thing as wrongdoing. Why not? Because if there's no God, there's no objective. It means non-changing. There would be no objective moral standard that determines what's right and wrong. So mankind's concept of morality had to have come from somewhere. And the Bible calls that somewhere God. You say, well, Brother Roger, I understand what you're saying, but there are a lot of people who still don't believe in God. What are some factors in that? What are some reasons why people don't believe in God? Now, what I'm going to say, it may not apply to every single person whom you encounter. Okay? One person may have his reason for not believing in God, and another person may give a different reason, and they may not support one another's reasoning. They've come to the same conclusion that there's no God. So don't assume that the thinking of atheists, the word atheist means one who doesn't believe in God. An agnostic is one who says, well, you can't really know for sure. And so don't assume that every agnostic's thinking is the same as other agnostics. And don't think that the reasoning or the thinking or the logic of all atheists is the same. Some people don't believe in God because that's the way they've been programmed. Maybe their parents taught them that there's no God, and so that's what their belief system is, that there's no God. Or there are a number of individuals who at one point in their life believed in God, but when they encountered someone whom they considered to be an intellectual, highly educated, intelligent person, perhaps a college professor, perhaps someone on television with a degree behind his name, they were persuaded by that person no longer to believe in a supreme being. So some people were raised in an environment where they didn't believe in God. Some were persuaded by those whom they considered to be well educated. And in that connection, there are some people who do not believe in God simply because they've never considered the evidence. It doesn't mean that they are bad people. It doesn't mean that they are not intelligent. It doesn't mean they're dishonest. It just may be the case that they've not really had access to persuasive reasoning about the existence of God. You say, well, aren't we told in Romans chapter 1 that, from the creation of all things, that God's eternal power and Godhead can be seen as true? A person can look at the universe and conclude this universe didn't come into existence on its own. It didn't come into existence by accident. There must have been a powerful maker. A person can come to that conclusion. It's the proper conclusion. Like Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. But there's no way that a person can know God in a biblical sense or know God's attributes without God revealing himself to mankind. Now, there are some people who in general don't like the idea of authority. They don't like anyone at any level exercising authority over them. They don't like to be told what to do. And so there are some people whose mentality is, I'm not believing in God. I'm not believing in some being to tell me what to do. I'll take care of myself, thank you. And in that connection, sometimes it's a matter of pride. There are some about whom Paul wrote in Romans 1, I believe it's verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. When humans say, I'm going to go it alone, I don't want God, I don't need God, I can take care of myself, then rather than demonstrating a high-level intelligence, they're demonstrating a genuine lack of wisdom. Perhaps you've encountered this. A person has had some dealings with someone who claims to be a Christian. And that person who claims to be a Christian, well, they did some things that weren't appropriate, and their behavior, their attitude, their speech was disgusting to this non-believer. And so he or she makes this conclusion. If you're the kind of person that your God makes, I'm never believing in your God. That scenario reminds us of what we read in Romans 2 and verse number 24, that because of the conduct of some people among the Jewish community, the Gentiles blasphemed the name of God. Again, the mindset basically was, if you're the kind of person that your God makes, I don't want anything to do with your God. And there may be some people who simply have not examined the evidence. And there are people who will tell you up front, say, look, I've looked at the evidence. I've looked at what you call evidence. I've considered your argument from design. I've considered your argument from cause and effect. I've considered your argument from morality. I've considered all those things. In fact, some people say, I used to go to church all the time. Some people say, I used to be a preacher. But I don't believe that stuff anymore. Well, those individuals, and it may be a combination of reasons, they've come to the conclusion that there's not sufficient evidence that God exists. But we've seen in our lesson today that indeed there is. I want to go over the questions real quickly. It's a review, a simple review of some of the things that we've gone over in this lesson. There are only 4 questions. Question number 1. Name New Testament verses where Godhead or the words divine nature are used. Well, we mentioned 3 of those verses, and I'll mention them in order. Acts 17, verse 29. Romans 1 and verse 20. Colossians 2 and verse number 9. Acts 17, 29, Romans 1, 20, and Colossians 2, 9. Second question. Briefly state the basic thrust of the design argument for the existence of God, sometimes called the blank argument. Design is teleological argument. Basically it goes like this. Where design exists, behind it there must be intelligent planning, a designer. In the material universe, design is evident. Thus, there must have been an intelligent designer who made it happen. And that intelligent designer is called God. Question number 3. Briefly state the basic thrust of the cause and effect argument for the existence of God, sometimes called the blank argument. Answer number 3. The blank is cosmo, C-O-S-M-O-logical, cosmological argument for the existence of God, cause and effect. Simply goes like this. For every effect, there must be an adequate or sufficient cause. Our universe exists. That is the effect. Since the universe could not make itself, since it is not eternal, and since it could not have come about by accident, it must have been created by an intelligent being. The universe is the effect. The adequate cause is God. And then the last question, number 4. Briefly state the basic thrust of the moral argument for the existence of God. All people have a sense of right and wrong. That is a concept of morality. All people have a concept of morality. If there is moral law, then there must have been a moral lawgiver. And the Bible would call that moral lawgiver God. I've enjoyed this first session of our study of the Godhead. Again, as I mentioned earlier, God willing, in our next lesson, we'll be taking a look at some of the attributes of God. And in the following lesson, lesson number 3, we'll look at some of God's other attributes. I think there are 13 in all that we will be considering. If you're taking this course for credit, then you need to fulfill your reading assignment, which is to read over lesson number 1 materials again before you come to the second class or before you watch the second video. Okay? And your writing assignment is to write an answer to all of the questions in each of the lessons. And in that material that I shared with you with the syllabus, you'll see some different books that have been written about God, about the Godhead, about His nature, about His existence. And those books are not flawless. They're written by humans, and so everything you read in those books you compare with what you read in the Bible. But I think you would find some assistance in those in understanding God and what He's like. Until next time, God bless.